For today, the subject matter is times of worship. And I want to begin with a prayer that my colleague Brian Spinks prayed when we co-taught Foundations of Christian Worship a number of years ago. And I think it was extemporaneous, I don't know, but I was so enamored with the prayer that I jotted it down, and I want to pray it today. Let us pray. Holy God, you were before time was. You will be when time is no more. For you are beyond time and the seasons. You are for all time and forever. In creation you gave us time and space, and we live and move and have our being in you and in time. We ask that we may use wisely our time to live the lives you have given us and to become the people you have called us to be. And when our time is ended, and when time itself is no more, may we behold your presence and be embraced with your love in and through all eternity. Amen. A couple of introductory remarks, and then I will begin with the first major segment on some anthropological, maybe cosmological observations. But the introductory remarks first. We are beginning to get close to our ending of the initial big segment in Foundations of Christian Worship, namely the segment dedicated to foundational elements. And in a sense, we could have well started the whole semester with today's topic, times of worship. And as a footnote, no, this has nothing to do with whether to offer Sunday worship at 8:30 or 11 or 5 p.m. or whatever. Much more importantly, we will consider how Christian worship is patterned in particular ways by rhythms of time. And we will look at 3, maybe 4, maybe 5, depending on how you configure it, cycles especially. This is where every time I teach Foundations of Christian Worship, I wish for a gifted artist to give me a visual for this session. Hasn't happened yet. But essentially, the 3 cycles we will be looking at today are the yearly cycle. Let's assume this is a year. A weekly cycle. Let's assume these are the weeks. And then a daily cycle, the 24 hours of a day. Why I say that it would need a gifted artist to depict this is not that I cannot even draw a circle. That's clear from my visual aid here. But that the whole thing needs to be set in motion, because this develops from year to year to year to year. And the blackboard isn't good enough to depict that motion. We already looked, in a sense, at the 4th rhythm, namely the life cycle, different for each of us, that always is woven into and intersects with these other established liturgical cycles in various ways. Now, in a sense, the overarching theological question and liturgical question could be, how do we map, how do we think about this foundational fact that liturgy always is marked by rhythms and happens in time? One way to think about it is that both liturgy and our own lives are situated somewhere between memory and hope. And within the larger whole of God's own vision for the fulfillment of God's creation. Now, before we get to theological and liturgical issues, let's begin with some anthropological, cosmological observations in order to situate the liturgical remarks. That's the first big section for today. And I have several points to make under that. First, and very basic, all life as we know it is marked by times and seasons. And that applies not only to human beings, but all things living. Plants react to sun and seasons, animals migrate, hibernate, and so on and so forth. Under that same point, there are cosmological reasons for that, or astronomical reasons for that. And they have to do with where we are located in the universe, in a sense. This is another very basic illustration. Where's my pen? That works. Let's say this is Earth. We have a moon that runs around Earth. Runs is not the right word. Orbits, thank you. And the Earth itself orbits around the sun. Let's leave it there, although by now we know way more about extending this out into the Milky Way and beyond. Now, these astronomical foundations give us some of the rhythms we'll be looking at. The day, which is simply the duration of the Earth's rotation around its own axis. The month, which is the duration of the moon's orbit around the Earth. And the year, the solar rhythm, is the Earth's orbit around the sun. So the day, in a sense, the terrestrial reality, the month, the lunar reality, the year, the solar reality. What's missing as an astronomical structure is the week. There is no astronomical basis for a weekly calendar, except that Jews and Christians are told in Genesis 1 that that's an order God created. But while day and month and year can be mapped astronomically, the week is a convention. If I remember correctly, the Soviet Union actually, in its early configuration, tried to configure time differently as when it comes to week, and it failed grandiosely. That doesn't mean that the week is a natural rhythm. It just means that cultural formations of time can be very deeply embedded. Now, just a bit more on not astronomy, but what I'm fascinated by is how human beings, how we and Christians liturgically map time. For whatever reason, sun and moon are not exactly in sync. So movements and mapping of days and years and months is not totally synchronized, which is why, for example, we have leap years and things like that. Actually, one other note on calendars. No, this is already number 2 under this first section. Calendars we keep and ways of mapping time are culture specific. They are specific to geography, life cycles, status, etc., etc. Let me flag that out, sketch that out with a couple of points. If we look at our own time here in this hemisphere, we're in early fall, but of course in another context, it is early spring. Here at Yale, we live with particular academic calendars. I think it's fair to say all of us are looking forward to fall break. It might be someone's birthday today. Nope. And finally, there are ecclesial calendars of our various faith communities. And of course, for those who are US citizens, midterm elections are coming. So you can already see how each of us lives with a variety of calendars, let's say. But what we can see in a small context like ours is also marks larger realities. Let me just give you a couple of examples. The Muslim or Islamic calendar is a strictly lunar calendar. So it has exactly 12 lunar months, which means the years are counted differently than they are in the Western calendar we are familiar with. There is, historically has been, and it has marked Christian practices, a calendar that is dominantly solar, that follows the sun. And that's the Julian calendar from Julius Caesar, and then with the Gregorian reform in the 16th century. This is the one most of us are familiar with. We think there are 365 days written in stone. Well, they are not written in stone because we have to include leap years to make up the unclarity, let's say, in the movement of sun and moon. A lunisolar mixture is the Jewish calendar, which is based primarily on lunar months. Now, in case you think this is totally irrelevant to my life, I just look up, you know, let's say a yearly calendar in my own church, and it'll tell me when Easter is and Christmas I sort of can figure out by myself. Well, that's true, but underneath that, what you're really witnessing is that the Christian calendars most of us are familiar with are mostly solar calendars, but a key feature is based on the lunar calendar, which is why Christians in the early centuries were sometimes accused of committing idolatry with regard to astral phenomena and deities. So the lunar calendar governs when Easter falls every year, which is why Easter never falls on the same, well, rarely falls on the same date, and why my birthday sometimes happens on Good Friday and sometimes happens on Easter Sunday. It's governed by the lunar calendar, namely on the first, it's calculated by the spring equinox and the first full moon after that. Yes, Christians have kept calendars ever since that decision because they needed to figure out by complicated calendric measures the dates for Easter in the following year. And now we let astronomical gadgets do that. Well, they had those early on. They just function slightly differently. Anyway, long story short, liturgy and astronomy and ways of mapping time intersect. A couple of more observations under this these anthropological reflections. Timekeeping and calendars routinely clash, and they clash in liturgy also. I can go into historic examples for that, but in the interest of time I won't. A note about our own context and our own culture. Time, I think in our context, has become marked in particular ways and with peculiar importance. I think culturally, it has become a sign of status to have little time. So the more important you are, the less time you have available for this, that, and the other. It used to be the opposite way. Leisure was a sign of status. You could afford not to work. That has switched. So busyness has become a sign of someone's worth, which is why you hardly ever hear someone at Yale say, I have time. Oh no, the opposite. And a couple of other features of our inhabiting time that simply we need to be aware of. One is that natural rhythms of time have dissolved through electricity, especially. I think I've said this before, that rhythms that marked practices of daily prayer for centuries become nonsensical when you just can what's the English word? Why am I thinking in German today? When you can flip a switch, a light switch. But then also with digital mediation, online we can hide a host of things, and we do. Our location, our age, our gender. But what we cannot hide is when we are online, the timestamp. unless you really work at it. So time has become marked in ways different from previous ways of marking and keeping time. I'm telling you all this because not that it's revelatory, but it needs to be figured into how we inhabit liturgical time. It doesn't need to be figured into it. It already shapes how we keep liturgical time. So, second, let's look theologically, and this will be brief, to Jewish and Christian ways of configuring time. There are really 4 different ways of appreciating time theologically, and it's not as if one is true and the others are wrong. It's that at different points in time they have surfaced and marked cultures in peculiar ways. So the first one is, and I'm simply rattling them off here, time is intrinsically sacred in the sense of it's a God-given reality, holy and good because it comes from the hands of God. I think probably my colleague's prayer is marked by that sense. It's a God-given gift for us to use. Second emphasis goes in a slightly different direction, and all of them can be rooted in the biblical witness, just different parts of it. Time is needing hallowing or sanctification because it's an aspect of a fallen world that needs hallowing. You often hear rationales for daily prayer, sort of a theology of daily prayer as we are doing this to hallow time. Well, that presupposes that without that, time is not hallowed. It needs hallowing by humans praying. The third is time as simply neutral, neither good nor bad in itself, but being made either good or bad by various activities that are taken up during it. And then a fourth, and this is especially prominent in theologies of worship, that time somehow interfaces with eternity, particularly in prayer and particularly in liturgy. Let me just say a couple of things about that point because it might not be immediately obvious where that comes from. One of the hinge points for that claim, or a sort of biblical warrant for it, is Isaiah's vision of God in the temple in Isaiah 6, and this sense of Isaiah entering into a worship of heavenly beings in his own entry into the physical temple. That's taken up to some degree in Revelation. Look at Revelation 4:8. So worship on earth is seen as participating in the eternal praise of God in heaven. Meaning, in worship we enter into a communion of praise that reaches beyond time and inscribes us into the eternal praise of God. So much for some theological themes regarding Christian understandings of time. And to some degree they shape cycles of timekeeping in Christian practices of worship as they develop over time. So, third, let's look at the three basic cycles. And the first one that doesn't, on my wonderful map, doesn't really come through very well is a daily. Yeah, let's assume this is a week with 7 days, so we have a daily cycle of worship already evident in the Hebrew Bible. Important here to note that many Semitic cultures mark time from sunset to sunset. So the new day begins with sunset. You see that in the coming of Shabbat. Jewish believers will mark the coming of the Sabbath day with sunset on Friday, what we consider evening, and welcome Queen Shabbat ritually at that moment. When do you think a day begins? No, I'm asking seriously. Sunrise, okay. I think,
When I wake up.
What does your online calendar think?
12 a.m.
Huh? Midnight. Yeah. So already when a day begins is culturally specific. And if you say sunrise, that is region specific. I taught in Sweden one semester, and sunrise in the summer was at 2:30 in the morning or what? Maybe 4 or 3. Well, I was not ready to begin the day then. So just another example of how timekeeping is shaped by a multitude of factors. Okay, but let's stay with the emergence of practices of daily prayer in the Christian tradition, hearkening back to Jewish practices. There are witnesses in the Hebrew Bible of 2 hinge moments of prayer in the day, and they are marked by the rhythm of the sun. So yes, sunrise and sundown. This is a culture, of course, that is not Scandinavian or Nordic, but is closer to the equator and thus has rhythms of time that don't diverge as much as they would do further north. There is also an invocation in one of the Psalms, I should have noted that, of praying 7 times a day. Although we don't know what the psalmist thinks the 7 times are. Earliest Christians embrace forms of daily prayer, already mentioned in the Acts of the Apostles, but different patterns are visible in scant evidence. The Didache, for example, envisions that Christians pray 3 times a day, and they pray the Lord's Prayer. Now, the Didache doesn't tell us when that would happen, but if you had a guess, 3 times a day, what would you think those 3 times are? Go ahead, just call it out.
Mealtime?
Meal times, interesting. I didn't even think of that. Okay, other options?
Sunrise, sundown, between.
Yeah.
Near the night.
Yeah, same. Meal times, we would need to know more about when people ate to configure. And of course, in an economy of scarcity, to assume that there were 3 meals a day is not, or that people ate 3 times a day also is not a given. Interesting. Okay. The Didache said.
Mentioned it because, like, so much of the early church centered around communal eating, like.
Yes. Yeah. Not clear that that happened 3 times a day.
No.
So, okay. There is an simple evening and morning pattern that is visible. Nighttime in some early nighttime meaning midnight in some early sources is marked as a particular time of prayer. Sometimes with surprising warrants attached to it. So the apostolic tradition, which has, we are in the 3rd or 4th century, nobody knows exactly, with that document, but it has a horarium, a schedule of daily prayer for Christians. That has prayer 7 times a day, so hearkening back to the Hebrew scriptures. But it does include a prayer at midnight, and the warrant for it, here's why you should do this. The warrant for it is cosmological. At that point in time, all beings, the sun, the moon, the waters, the rivers, the animals, pause to praise God. Oh, and by the way, I'm channeling the apostolic tradition. Oh, and by the way, Jesus also mentions midnight. Yeah, Jesus does, but Jesus doesn't say pray at midnight. So it's a sort of biblical warrant that is somewhat weak. The cosmological warrant is very strong. You pray because all creation pauses, so you get up at midnight to mark that time.
How do we know that sleeping patterns in ancient times or even like early medieval times differed from us, and how did they shape prayer times as well? Because as far as I know, it was not uncommon for people to also have to get up during the night to feed and do whatever do stuff that we don't do nowadays anymore. So we sleep through like 8 hours if you're lucky. They wouldn't necessarily have done that, so they would have been up anyways.
Yes. Yeah, that's correct. The patterns of what you do at night were very different from ours. And at least researchers now claim that pre-modern people mostly spent the night in phases of rest and sleep and doing other stuff. I think in the apostolic tradition, I don't have the document with me now, it says get up at midnight. It doesn't say pause, whatever else you were doing. So midnight, at least in the apostolic tradition, was coded as a time of rest. Maybe not sleep, but rest. So, yeah, but for pre-modern people, what I think of as torture, having to get up at midnight to pray, wasn't necessarily that at all, because the rhythms of life were different. Okay, what the exact nature of these prayer times was, or what shape they might take, is a matter of scholarly debate. And it's also uncertain how exactly these Christian times of daily prayer relate to Jewish times of daily prayer. if I want to stay true to leaving time for questions, I have to jump across a whole lot of things. Let me try and think how best to do that. Quick summary. With the 4th century and written witnesses to practices of daily prayer becoming more visible and richer, we see 2 divergent forms of daily prayer emerge. At least that's what scholars have told us for the longest time. I think they are wrong in thinking of 2 dominant forms, so I'll add my third in a second. The 2 dominant forms is what scholars have called the cathedral office. This is a misnomer. It's really a parish-based daily prayer rhythm. And its characteristics, in contradistinction to the monastic rhythm of daily prayer that also develops, is that it is rich in symbol, particularly when you think about the evening service. Its key element is the lighting of a lamp. Second characteristic, chosen psalmody. So you choose psalms for the evening that speak to night or evening. You choose psalms for the morning, like Psalm 63, that speak of morning. So select to the specific time of day. It's marked by a diversity of ministries. So you might have a reader, a deacon, a presbyter, a bishop. And it included hymns, non-biblical hymns. The monastic daily prayer rounds that develop are very different. They are basically psalm-based meditative prayer, practiced in common. And in this way of daily praying and praying with the Psalms, you essentially begin with Psalm 1 and read through. In the end, 150 are parsed over a week, mostly. But some monastic communities also did more than 150 in a week. And so it doesn't matter at that point whether you read Psalm 63, a morning psalm, in midday or at night. It just comes when it comes. Long story short, that monastic practice begins to shape parish practices. And in the Middle Ages, you see what is called a monasticization of the cathedral office. I want to add a third practice of prayer that these scholars, and a site, S-I-T-E, always forget. And it's the domestic site. Domestic here understood as communal, but not ecclesial, necessarily ecclesial space. But that too is a site with rounds of daily prayer. They begin in the Middle Ages especially to be shaped by ecclesial forms of prayer. So the books of hours you sometimes see, medieval prayer books for laity, often have included psalms or offices that would have been prayed in ecclesial space. Okay, 16th century, I'm going to leave this to Dr. Sayer, but just to say that rhythms of daily prayer in various churches begin to diverge and diversify. The invention of the printing press plays a major role in the proliferation and availability of books for prayer, but we also have a movement that thinks of the only book necessary for prayers being the Bible, and prayer having to be extemporaneous to be authentic. So you move away from reading prayers out of a book. My second cycle, the week. As I mentioned, this isn't a cycle governed by the movement of the sun or the moon or the earth, but it is a rhythm of time present in ancient Israel, which lived by a 7-day week and found reason for that in God's rhythm given in creation, especially Genesis 1, 6 days of creation, 7th day God rests. And especially in exile, for Jews, keeping Shabbat emerges as a critical marker of identity, becomes a sign of the covenant community over and against other ways of belonging. Amongst earliest Christians, there is a complicated relationship to the Sabbath. Jesus rises not on the Sabbath. He does actually what God does in creation. He rests in the grave, but then rises on the first day of the week, Sunday. And for Christians, that becomes the prominent way of marking the week. Sunday as the hinge point. The day of resurrection, which is the first day of creation and therefore of recreation in Christian thinking. Yeah?
Can I ask you something about that? Because I know that there has been a tradition of understanding the Sunday as an 8th day.
Yeah.
Outside of the weekly Sabbath.
Yeah.
As a theological day.
Yeah. It's both. It's the first day of the week. It's Sunday, the day of the resurrection, and it becomes understood also as a pointer to eschatological hope, as the 8th day, the fulfillment of time. But they coexist, these understandings of how Sunday comes to be lived and configured. Yeah. There is some, just in case you ever read Revelation 1:10, it invokes the Lord's Day. It's not quite clear whether for the writer of Revelation that is still Saturday, Shabbat, or whether it's already the Christian Lord's Day, Sunday. So by the 2nd century, it's clear that the term is used for Sunday. And lo and behold, in 321, with Christianity becoming a legal religion in the empire, Sunday becomes a day when Christians are allowed not to work. Up until then, it was a working day. Footnote, there are Christians who continue to mark Saturday as the main day of the week. So some Baptist groups, Seventh-day Adventists prominently keep Shabbat. Yeah, let's leave it at that. The year. If you Google liturgical year, put in and Google images, that's where you get 1 million calendars for the liturgical year, and they are all quite rudimentary and nice and colorful. The problem is that they suggest that's the only way Christians mark time, so I want a better calendar. If somebody can create a calendar with at least 3 cycles, best would be 4, and put it in motion, I will use it in foundation. So, the year. Again, we go back to Hebrew scriptures. A yearly cycle of feasts is already present in ancient Israel. And Christians also develop a yearly calendar, which is clearly visible by the 4th century, with Easter and Pentecost, and then Lent being the central hinge point, and the Christmas cycle emerging soon after. Ruth Duck takes you through some of the complexities of how some of the datings happened regarding Christmas and Easter. I won't spend too much time around that, just to say that Christmas is set calendarically, no matter which year you are in. It's on the 25th of December. Easter is set by the movements of the moon, which changes constantly, so you never know from one year to the next when Easter is. Alongside the yearly calendar, and that's why I said I want a map that is richer than just marking the year, in a sense we superimpose on the outer thing is supposed to be the yearly calendar. But we superimpose on that another calendar, and it's the sanctoral cycle. So the calendar of saints' days, if you're in a community that keeps those, they are also mostly calendric days. So, what should we choose? Oh, St. Francis. Thank you. 4th of October, the day he died. Yeah, so that's a calendric date. It doesn't change with anything. The problems emerge because that sanctoral cycle can bite other cycles, particularly the other yearly cycle, and there are complicated rules for which I always think of it like a card game, which cycle trumps in a given conflict. Okay. And then, of course, you add in a possible 5th cycle, the life cycle of yourself or people in your congregation. And you have a quite complex configuration of liturgy happening as in the interplay of these various cycles, especially as they are moving through time from year to year. I want to draw to a close. Lots more could be said about historical developments. If you are interested in practices of daily prayer, Paul Bradshaw has written extensively on that. for the emergence of the liturgical year. Maxwell Johnson has a volume with primary and secondary sources. I want to close with some reflections on why bother about rhythms of time and practices of worship and practices of prayer. I guess a simple answer could be that no worship service, no moment of prayer ever happens outside of these various rhythms. We can never step outside, even if we envision worship as a foretaste of eschatological eternal praise of God. A more positive spin than saying, well, that's just the way it is, it's basic to everything we do, would be to conceive of our own lives and the life of the church as a pilgrimage, as a journey through time, and therefore marked by stations, in a sense, marked by stops on the journey, on the pilgrimage. A pilgrimage is never just a continuous walking, or whatever, however you engage in pilgrimage. If you do a river pilgrimage, you will be canoeing. But there are rhythms in the pilgrimage. And liturgy, I think, best attends to these moments in time consciously. And maybe even rendering that visible in your parishes. There is a parish in New York City, and with that I'll end and open up for questions. There is a parish in New York City whose sanctuary has the constellation of stars as it was when Jesus was born. So it's disorienting in a sense because it takes you back in time. But it's also a reminder of time being a fundamental marker for Christians of the life of faith.